Marcus Coleman's 60 years of life hadn't prepared him for this moment, a cheetah cub gripping his khaki pants with desperate paws, amber eyes pleading with an intelligence that defied nature. The other tourists screamed from the Land Rover, but Marcus stood frozen, his wedding ring catching the harsh African sun as trembling fingers reached downward. "Get back in the vehicle," Jimmy shouted. But the cub wasn't attacking, it was begging. Its small body trembled with exhaustion, dust-covered spots heaving with labored breaths. Then it did something that shattered Marcus's composure. The cub gently took his weathered hand between its jaws, not biting but pulling, tugging him toward the thorn bush thicket. In that instant, Sarah's voice echoed across 10 years of grief. "Sometimes angels come with spots instead of wings, Mark." The cub released his hand and cried a sound so human in its desperation that Marcus took his first step off the safe path, toward whatever truth awaited in the shadows. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. 2 weeks earlier, Marcus Coleman had stood at Minneapolis International Airport, clutching a one-way ticket to Kenya. 10 years of avoiding this journey ended with his therapist's gentle words, "Sarah wouldn't want you frozen in grief, Marcus." The retired history professor, 58 years old with silver threading through once dark hair, carried 2 items Sarah had left behind: her leather journal, worn soft from handling, and a small bottle of lavender perfume she'd worn every day of their 30-year marriage. The Masai Mara stretched before him now, endless golden grassland punctuated by acacia trees. This dry season had been particularly harsh, the usual verdant patches now brown and brittle. The Olololo escarpment rose in the distance, its ancient face unchanged despite the decades since Sarah had volunteered at the conservation station nestled at its base. That station, now expanded but still rustic, bore a small plaque he couldn't bring himself to read, "In memory of Sarah Coleman, friend to all creatures." Marcus had chosen Jimmy Thompson's safari company specifically. The 45-year-old former Marine from Arizona ran smaller, more intimate tours. Jimmy's weathered face showed the kind of understanding that came from his own losses in Afghanistan. "First time in Kenya?" Jimmy had asked at the airport. "First time back," Marcus had corrected, and Jimmy had simply nodded, recognizing the weight of those words. The tour group was small, just 6 people, including Grace Mitchell, a 70-year-old retired nurse from Houston who'd buried her husband 5 years prior. "Adventure keeps me young," she'd declared, though Marcus saw the same searching in her eyes he felt in his own. Grace had taken to sitting beside him during drives, offering silent companionship. Dr. Ruth Anderson still worked at the conservation station, though Marcus had avoided meeting her. The 62-year-old veterinarian from Vermont had been with Sarah that final day. Ruth had written letters, so many letters, but Marcus had never opened them. Seeing her would make it real in a way he wasn't ready for. The landscape held memories in every shadow. There, the copia where Sarah had photographed her first cheetah. Here, the riverbed where she'd helped treat an injured gazelle. Each landmark was a ghost of happiness, a reminder of Sarah's infectious laugh and her absolute belief that every creature deserved compassion. Marcus touched the backpack containing her journal, its pages filled with observations about animal behavior, pressed flowers, and love notes to him. He'd brought it to leave at her memorial, a final goodbye. He never imagined it would become the key to an entirely different journey. The afternoon sun hung heavy at 3:30 p.m. when Jimmy stopped the Land Rover at a designated photography point overlooking the savannah. Marcus stepped out with the others, his camera hanging untouched around his neck. Grace was already snapping photos of a distant herd of zebras, while the younger couples chattered excitedly about the view. The Olololo escarpment cast long shadows across the grassland, and the air shimmered with heat that made everything dreamlike and uncertain. The cub appeared from the acacia bushes at 3:47 p.m. Marcus would remember the exact time because he'd been checking his watch, counting down the minutes until he could return to his tent and escape the cheerful tourist chatter. The young cheetah couldn't have been more than 4 months old, its oversized paws suggesting future growth, spots still fuzzy with youth. But it was the sound that made everyone freeze, not a growl or snarl, but a cry so plaintive, so desperately human, that Grace dropped her camera. "Nobody move," Jimmy commanded, his hand moving instinctively to the flare gun at his belt. But the cub wasn't displaying any aggressive behavior. Instead, it approached Marcus directly, deliberately, its amber eyes locked on his with an intelligence that defied every wildlife documentary he'd ever watched. When the cub reached him, it did something extraordinary. It stood on its hind legs and placed its front paws against Marcus's khaki pants, like a child seeking comfort. "Get back in the vehicle." Jimmy's voice carried military authority. But Marcus couldn't move. The cub was trembling, its small body radiating exhaustion and fear. Dust covered its spotted coat, and Marcus noticed brambles caught in its fur, small scratches along its flanks. This wasn't a healthy cub playing or exploring, this was desperation incarnate. "Marcus, slowly back away," Grace whispered, though her nurse's training was evident in how she assessed the situation. "Something's wrong with it." The cub dropped back to all fours and gently took Marcus's hand in its mouth, not biting. Barely any pressure, just holding. Then it pulled, tugged really, looking back toward the dense thornbush thicket 50 yards away. It released his hand and took a few steps toward the bushes, then returned, repeating the gesture. The message was unmistakable. "Follow me." "You can't be serious," Jimmy said as Marcus took a step forward. "Park regulations are crystal clear, no interaction with wildlife. You could lose your visa, face prosecution. And that's if the cub's mother doesn't kill you first." "What if the mother's hurt?" Grace interjected, surprising everyone. "That cub's too young to be alone. Look at it, it's desperate." The group erupted in debate. The younger couples wanted to call the rangers immediately. Jimmy insisted on following protocol. Grace argued for compassion. Through it all, the cub continued its heartbreaking dance, approaching Marcus, tugging gently, retreating toward the bushes, crying with increasing urgency. "I'm going," Marcus heard himself say. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere Sarah used to live. "Something's wrong, and this cub came to us for help." "Us." Jimmy stepped forward. "It came to you specifically. Out of 6 people, it chose you. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" It did, but Marcus was already walking, following the increasingly frantic cub toward the thorn bush. Jimmy cursed and followed, keeping his hand on the flare gun. Grace grabbed the first aid kit from the vehicle, her practical nature overcoming caution. The others stayed behind, one already on the satellite phone. The thorn bush thicket was dense, branches catching at clothes and skin. The cub led them through a narrow game trail, its cries now answered by a weak chirping sound ahead. Marcus pushed through the final barrier and stopped abruptly. The mother cheetah lay on her side, her elegant form marred by a vicious wound on her left hind leg. The injury was severe, deep gashes that had already attracted flies, but it wasn't from another predator. Marcus recognized the pattern from Sarah's journal sketches: snare damage. A poacher's wire trap had done this. The mother's breathing was labored, her usually bright eyes dulled with pain. But when she saw Marcus, something shifted in her expression. Instead of snarling or trying to flee, she remained still, watching him with what could only be described as recognition. Near her, tangled in the thorns, a piece of wire snare still gleamed with blood. "Poachers," Jimmy breathed, his anger palpable. "Those bastards are getting bolder." The mother cheetah made a soft chirping sound, and 2 more cubs emerged from deeper in the thicket, both females, slightly smaller than the male who'd sought help. They pressed against their mother's belly, seeking comfort she could barely provide. Marcus knelt slowly, maintaining eye contact with the injured mother. Her breathing steadied, and impossibly, she seemed to relax at his presence. The male cub, Sabi. Marcus found himself naming it pressed against his leg, trembling with exhaustion and relief. At 4:30 p.m., as Marcus knelt beside the injured mother cheetah, his eyes caught something that made his heart stop. On her right shoulder, partially hidden by her spotted coat, was a perfectly circular scar about the size of a quarter. The mark was old, healed into white tissue against the tawny fur. His hand trembled as he reached for Sarah's journal in his backpack. Frantically flipping through pages he'd read 100 times. There it was, Sarah's sketch from December 3rd, 10 years ago. A young female cheetah with an identical circular scar, rescued from a poacher's bullet wound. Sarah had named her Hopeful and spent 3 weeks nursing her back to health. The sketch's margin notes read, "She watches me with such intelligence. Sometimes I swear she understands every word. Released her today. Cried like a baby." "That's impossible," Marcus whispered. But his hands were already searching the thorn bush behind the injured cat. His fingers caught on something fabric. He pulled it free, a faded volunteer identification tag. The lamination cracked but still readable. Sarah Coleman, Wildlife Conservation Volunteer, Mara Station 2014. The mother cheetah's eyes followed his movement as he held the tag. Marcus's voice cracked as he spoke. "Hopeful are you? Are you hopeful?" The cheetah's ear twitched, the same distinctive response Sarah had described in her journal. The injured animal made a soft chirping sound, almost like acknowledgement. Grace gasped behind him, while Jimmy stood frozen, his usual commanding presence replaced by stunned silence. "This can't be real," Jimmy finally managed. "Cheetahs don't remember humans after 10 years. But the evidence was undeniable. The scar, the location, the tag, and most impossibly, the cheetah's calm acceptance of Marcus's presence despite her vulnerability. The male cub Sabi pressed closer to Marcus, as if understanding something momentous was happening. "We need to get her help," Grace said, her practical nature cutting through the shock. "That wound is infected. She won't last another day without antibiotics." "Absolutely not," Jimmy's military bearing returned. "I sympathize, Marcus, I really do. But park regulations are ironclad. No intervention in natural processes. If we're caught helping her, it's a federal offense here. You could face 5 years in Kenyan prison. I could lose my license, my entire business. Natural processes." Marcus's voice carried an edge of anger he hadn't felt in years. "There's nothing natural about a wire snare. Poachers did this." "Doesn't matter to the authorities," Jimmy countered. "The rule exists for a reason. Where does intervention stop? Do we save every injured animal, play God with the ecosystem?" Grace stepped forward, her 70 years of life lending authority to her words. "James Thompson, I've watched you photograph these animals with tears in your eyes. Don't hide behind regulations now. This mother has 3 cubs who'll die without her. And this connection to Marcus's wife, doesn't that mean something?" The argument escalated, voices carrying across the savannah. None of them noticed the Land Rover approaching until it stopped nearby. Dr. Ruth Anderson emerged, her weathered face tight with concern. The veterinarian moved with purpose despite her 62 years, medical kit in hand. "I got a call about tourists interfering with wildlife," she said, then stopped abruptly when she saw the injured cheetah. "My God, is that—" She dropped to her knees beside the animal, her professional assessment momentarily forgotten. "Hope, is that you, girl?" The cheetah responded to Ruth's voice with a weak purr, attempting to lift her head. Ruth's hands moved expertly over the injury, her face darkening. "This snare wound is 3 days old. Sepsis is setting in." She looked up at Marcus, and recognition dawned. "You're Sarah's husband, Marcus." "You knew this cheetah?" Marcus asked, though the answer was obvious. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Knew her. I helped Sarah save her 10 years ago. And—" She paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Marcus, there's something you need to know about how Sarah died." The air seemed to still. Even the cubs stopped their restless movement. "The report said it was an accident," Marcus said slowly. "A vehicle collision during an emergency veterinary run." Ruth shook her head, her voice heavy with a decade of carried guilt. "That was the official story. The truth is, Sarah died protecting this cheetah. Hope was pregnant, being hunted by the same poaching ring that had shot her before. Sarah heard about it on the radio and went out alone. She put herself between the poachers and Hope." Marcus felt his legs weaken. Grace steadied him while Jimmy cursed under his breath. The poachers had Hope and her newborn cubs cornered, Ruth continued. Sarah drove her truck directly into their path. The collision was deliberate. She gave Hope time to escape with her babies. The poachers fled. But Sarah... Ruth's voice broke. She lived long enough to make me promise to report it as an accident. She didn't want you fighting for justice and getting hurt. She wanted you to remember her happy. Marcus stared at the injured cheetah Hope, who Sarah had died protecting. The 3 cubs nearby were likely Hope's second or third litter, descendants of the cubs Sarah had saved. Sabi nuzzled against his hand, and suddenly the cub's desperate plea for help took on new meaning. Had Hope somehow known who Marcus was? Had she sent her cub to him specifically? She's going to die if we don't act, Ruth said, shifting back to medical urgency. The infection is advanced, but I can save her. However, Jimmy's right about the regulations. If we do this, we're all taking an enormous risk. Then we take it, Grace declared. My husband died following every rule, being careful, being proper. He never took a single risk. And you know what? He regretted it at the end. Said he wished he'd been brave just once. Jimmy ran his hand over his face, his internal struggle visible. There's an old ranger station, abandoned, about 3 miles north. No surveillance, no patrols. If we move her there... You're willing to help? Marcus asked. Sarah saved this cheetah family once, Jimmy said quietly. Maybe it's time someone finished what she started. But we do this smart. No social media, no photos, no evidence. And if we're caught, we were never here together. Agreed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Mara, an unlikely conspiracy formed around an injured cheetah named Hope. Ruth prepared a sedative with practiced efficiency. Jimmy and Marcus fashioned a makeshift stretcher from canvas and branches. Grace kept watch, her sharp eyes scanning for other vehicles or rangers. The male cub, Sabi, refused to leave Marcus's side during the preparations, while his sisters huddled close to their sedated mother. As they carefully lifted Hope onto the stretcher, Marcus noticed something that would haunt him. The cheetah's eyes remained open, watching him with absolute trust, as if she knew Sarah's love had finally come full circle. At 6:00 p.m., as they began the careful journey to the abandoned station, Ruth shared one final revelation. Sarah's last words were, "Tell Marcus to follow the hearts." We thought she was delirious, talking about love. But now, she gestured to the cubs trotting alongside the stretcher. I think she meant something else entirely. The abandoned ranger station materialized through the acacia trees as the sun touched the horizon at 6:00 p.m. The structure, built in the 1970s, stood like a forgotten sentinel walls of weathered concrete block. A corrugated metal roof partially collapsed on one end, windows long since claimed by termites. But it had what they needed: isolation, shelter, and a functioning well pump that Jimmy discovered still drew water. Ruth worked with military precision, transforming the least damaged room into a makeshift veterinary clinic. I need more hands, she announced, spreading supplies across a salvaged table. Marcus, you're going to learn field medicine whether you like it or not. The mother cheetah, Hope, lay sedated but restless on a bed of canvas tarps and dried grass. The infection's sweet, sickly smell filled the space. Ruth had already administered antibiotics, but her expression remained grim. The wound is deeper than I thought. There's necrotic tissue that needs debriding. Marcus had never imagined himself holding surgical instruments while Ruth carefully cut away dead flesh from a cheetah's leg. His hands shook initially, but Sabi's presence steadied him. The young male cub had positioned himself where he could watch both his mother and Marcus, those amber eyes tracking every movement with unnerving intelligence. Your wife had the same gentle touch, Ruth observed, guiding Marcus's hand as he irrigated the wound. Sarah always said healing was about intention as much as technique. By 9:00 p.m., they had cleaned and dressed the wound, administered fluids, and created a recovery space. The 2 female cubs had finally approached, drawn by their mother's familiar scent. One was slightly larger, with distinctive tear marks that extended further than typical. The smaller one had a white patch on her chest. Grace had already named them Patience and Faith. "We can't stay here every night," Jimmy said, standing watch at the door. "People will notice if we're gone from camp." Ruth pulled out an old satellite phone. "I have contacts people who believe conservation sometimes requires breaking rules. Former colleagues, local Maasai who knew Sarah, even a few reformed poachers who now work against their former associates. They'll help with supplies and take shifts watching Hope." The network she described sounded like something from a spy novel. But within 2 hours, a weathered Toyota appeared carrying Dr. Benjamin Kamau, a Kenyan veterinarian who'd retired after refusing to euthanize healthy animals seized from traffickers. "Sarah saved my career once," he said simply. "I owe her memory this much." That first night, Marcus couldn't bring himself to leave. He sat beside Hope, Sarah's journal open in his lap, reading aloud by lantern light. It felt absurd reading to a sedated cheetah, but Sabi curled against his leg, purring softly at the sound of his voice. December 5th. Hope is getting stronger. She watches me with such knowing. Today she allowed me to touch the scar where the bullet entered. It's like she understands I'm trying to help. Marcus would laugh at me for being sentimental, but I swear she remembers kindness. As he read, he discovered pages stuck together by age and humidity. Carefully separating them revealed entries he'd never seen, written in Sarah's hurried script during her final weeks. November 12th, the dreams are getting stronger. I see Marcus standing where I once stood, but he's not alone. There's a young cheetah with him, one that hasn't been born yet. In the dream, they're both healing something in each other. I know how this sounds, but Kenya has taught me that some things transcend explanation. If something happens to me, I pray Marcus finds his way here. The animals will recognize him. Love leaves a signature that death can't erase. Marcus's throat constricted. Had Sarah somehow known the rational professor in him rejected such thoughts? But here he sat, with her cheetah's cub pressed against him, living the scene she'd described. Day 2 began with crisis. Hope's temperature had spiked during the night, and one of the female cubs' Faith was listless, refusing her portion of the antelope meat Jimmy had somehow procured. "It's stress," Ruth diagnosed, examining the small cub. "Young cheetahs are incredibly sensitive. Seeing her mother injured, the disruption of their routine, her immune system is compromised." Marcus watched Ruth work, noting how she spoke to the cubs as if they were her patients at a regular clinic. "Your mother is strong," she told Faith, administering vitamins. "She survived a bullet, gave birth in the wild, raised multiple litters. She's not giving up now." The network Ruth had activated proved remarkable. By noon, they had additional antibiotics, proper surgical supplies, and even a small solar panel to power a field refrigerator for medications. A Maasai elder named Sankau arrived with traditional remedies, plants his people had used for generations to treat livestock wounds. "Your wife understood," Sankau told Marcus through Benjamin's translation. "The land remembers those who respect it. This cheetah family is known to us. The mothers teach their cubs to avoid our livestock, to hunt only wild prey. Such wisdom deserves protection." But protection became complicated when Jimmy returned from camp with troubling news. Rangers are asking questions. A tourist posted a photo on Instagram. You can see our vehicle in the background near where Hope was found. They're investigating a possible wildlife interference incident. Grace, who'd been maintaining appearances at the tourist camp, had her own intelligence. "I've been talking to the other groups. 3 different tours have reported snares in this area over the past month. There's definitely an active poaching ring." Marcus felt rage building. The same group that had killed Sarah was still operating. "We should report them." "With what evidence?" Jimmy challenged. "We reveal what we know. We reveal what we're doing." Hope and her cubs get confiscated, probably euthanized because she's been contaminated by human contact. The investigative thread grew more tangled when Benjamin recognized the snare type. "This wire. This particular twist pattern, I've seen it before." There's a syndicate that targets cheetahs specifically. They sell cubs to Middle Eastern buyers as exotic pets. The mothers are killed or left to die. Sarah was investigating them, Ruth revealed. I found her notes after the accident. She had names, locations, even photographs. But the police said it wasn't enough evidence, and then they lost the files. That evening, as Marcus changed Hope's dressings, a skill he was developing with surprising competence, he made a decision. We're not just saving Hope, we're finishing what Sarah started. Grace surprised everyone by producing a small digital camera. I've been documenting everything: the snare, the wounds, the treatment. My late husband was a prosecutor. He always said evidence was everything. We build a case properly. We can expose these poachers without revealing our location. Jimmy's transformation over these 2 days was remarkable. The rigid rule follower had become their most valuable strategist. I know rangers who are clean, who hate the corruption as much as we do. Give me time. I'll feel out who we can trust. By sunset of day 2, Hope was showing improvement. Her eyes had regained some clarity, and she'd managed to eat a small portion of meat. More importantly, she was actively watching her cubs, making soft chirping sounds to comfort them. Faith had also rallied, playing tentatively with patience while Sabi maintained his vigil beside Marcus. That night brought an unexpected visitor. A young Kenyan woman arrived on foot, carrying a backpack full of medical supplies. I'm Amara, she introduced herself. I was an intern when Dr. Sarah worked here. She taught me that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. Amara brought disturbing intelligence. The poaching ring has a schedule. They check their snares every 5 days. The next check is tomorrow night. They'll find blood, tracks. They'll know the cheetah survived and might come looking. The group sat in a circle, lantern light casting shadows on worried faces. They were no longer just treating an injured animal, they were in active opposition to dangerous criminals. We could move Hope, Benjamin suggested. She's too weak, Ruth countered. Moving her now could kill her. Then we defend this position, Jimmy said, his military background surfacing. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan. I know how to secure a perimeter. With what army? Grace asked, though her tone suggested she was ready to enlist. With intelligence, Marcus said. Sarah's journal opened before him. Sarah wrote here about the poachers' patterns. They avoid areas with recent tourist activity. What if we create the illusion of heavy tourism around here? Over the next hours, they developed an elaborate deception. Jimmy would bring different vehicles past the area, creating multiple tire tracks. Grace would coordinate with other tourists to report amazing cheetah sightings near the abandoned station, ensuring rangers would increase patrols. Amara would spread word through the local communities that researchers were conducting a study in the area. Day 3 brought both progress and peril. Hope managed to stand for the first time, though she couldn't bear weight on the injured leg. The cubs celebrated with an energy that lifted everyone's spirits. Sabi actually played, pouncing on Marcus's bootlaces with kitten-like enthusiasm, but their celebration was premature. At noon, Benjamin's phone buzzed with a warning from his network. Rangers found our tire tracks. They're planning a sweep of this area tomorrow. The walls were closing in. Hope needed at least another week of treatment. Faith, while improved, was still fragile. Moving them would be dangerous, but discovery would be catastrophic. We're out of time, Ruth said, her usual calm cracking. I can't. I won't let them take Hope. Not after everything. Marcus looked at the cheetah family. Hope grooming patience, while Faith played with a feather. Sabi sat beside him, the young male's trust absolute. These weren't just animals anymore. They were Sarah's legacy, living proof that compassion could transcend species. Sarah faced the same choice, he said quietly. Save herself or save Hope. She chose Hope. He stood. Decision made. Tomorrow, when the Rangers come, I'll create a distraction. Lead them away. You get Hope and the cubs to safety. That's suicide, Jimmy protested. Legal suicide. You'll be arrested, deported, banned for life. Then I'll have done one thing that mattered, Marcus replied, his hand resting on Sabi's head. I'll have chosen love over fear, just like Sarah did. Grace stood, her 70 years carrying the weight of authority. No one's sacrificing themselves. We've all lost enough. There has to be another way. As the sun set on day 3, they huddled together, an unlikely family bound by a shared mission. Hope watched from her makeshift bed, her golden eyes reflecting the lantern light. She made a sound Marcus had never heard before, a deep, rumbling purr that seemed to acknowledge their efforts. Listen, Ruth said suddenly. Do you hear that? In the distance, engines, multiple vehicles, approaching fast. Their time had run out sooner than expected. Marcus grabbed Sarah's journal, pressing it to his chest. Whatever came next, he would face it. But as Sabi pressed against his leg, trembling but steadfast, Marcus realized something profound. He wasn't facing it alone. Sarah's love had created a web of connections that death couldn't sever. Every person here, every choice they'd made, was part of her continuing story. The engines grew louder. Jimmy moved to the door, Grace beside him. Ruth prepared a sedative for Hope in case they needed to run. Benjamin and Amara gathered the medical supplies. And in that moment of crisis, something extraordinary happened. Hope stood on all 4 legs, limping but determined, and positioned herself between her cubs and the door. Despite her injury, despite her weakness, she was ready to defend her family. Marcus understood then what Sarah had seen in this cheetah. It wasn't just an animal to be saved. It was a mirror of the best of humanity: courage despite fear, love despite loss, hope despite impossible odds. The vehicle stopped outside. Doors slammed. Footsteps approached. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see if their makeshift sanctuary would hold, or if everything they'd fought for would crumble. But whatever happened, they'd already won something precious. They'd proved that Sarah's compassion lived on, that strangers could become family, and that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to honor what truly mattered. Day 4 began with the sound that would haunt Marcus forever, a rattling wheeze from Hope's chest that sent Ruth scrambling for her stethoscope at 4:17 a.m. The cheetah's breathing had changed during the night, shifting from the steady rhythm of healing to something labored and wrong. Cardiac arrhythmia, Ruth announced, her face pale in the lantern light. The infection has spread to the pericardium, the sac around her heart. She needs surgery immediately or she'll be dead within hours. The abandoned station's makeshift clinic was woefully inadequate for cardiac surgery. They had basic supplies, antibiotics, and Ruth's field experience, but operating on a cheetah's heart in these conditions bordered on impossible. Benjamin was already on his satellite phone, desperately trying to source additional equipment from his network. We need better light, sterile conditions, and cardiac medications I don't have, Ruth said, her usual calm cracking. Without them, she has maybe a 10% chance. Marcus watched Sabi pace frantically around his mother, the young cub somehow sensing the crisis. The 2 females, Patience and Faith, huddled in the corner, their usual playfulness replaced by fearful stillness. Hope's golden eyes, which had shown such trust, were now glazed with pain and confusion. There's a veterinary clinic in Narak, Amara suggested. It's 2 hours away. But she won't survive transport. Ruth cut her off. Her heart is already struggling. The stress of movement would kill her. Jimmy had been standing guard, but he entered with urgency. We have another problem. Fresh tire tracks on the access road, not rangers. These are older vehicles, moving without lights. Could be poachers checking their trap lines. Grace, who'd been boiling water for sterilization, spoke with her nurse's pragmatism. Then we deal with both crises. Ruth operates with what we have. The rest of us handle whoever's coming. The next hours unfolded with desperate intensity. Ruth and Benjamin transformed their rough space into an operating theater using plastic sheeting, duct tape, and every battery-powered light they could find. Marcus became Ruth's assistant by necessity, his hands steady despite his terror. following her clipped instructions as she prepared for surgery that would have challenged her in a proper hospital. At 7:30 a.m., as Ruth made her first incision, they heard vehicles approaching 2 trucks, moving slowly, engines rough. Jimmy recognized the sound immediately. Those aren't government vehicles. Too old, too loud. Through the cracked window, Marcus saw them 3 men emerging from beaten pickup trucks, carrying rifles and machetes. One man stood out, tall and scarred, with the bearing of someone used to violence. Marcus's blood chilled as he recognized him from Sarah's journal sketches she'd drawn him multiple times, labeled simply as the killer. "That's him," Ruth whispered, glancing up from Hope's open chest cavity. "That's Jonas Mutua. He's the one who was there when Sarah died." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow, but there was no time to process it. Hope's heart was visible through the surgical opening, the inflamed pericardium obviously infected. Ruth worked with fierce concentration, draining fluid, administering medications directly to the cardiac tissue. Sabi had to be physically restrained by Grace to keep him from his mother. His cries were heartbreaking, almost human in their desperation. Marcus wanted to comfort him but couldn't leave Ruth's side. She needed his hands to hold instruments, maintain suction, keep the surgical field clear. Outside, the poachers were examining the ground, following the blood trail from 3 days ago. Their voices carried through the thin walls, speaking in Swahili with occasional English phrases. Benjamin translated in whispers. "They're confused. The blood trail leads here, but they see vehicle tracks, signs of activity." Jonas's voice rose in anger. Marcus didn't need translation to understand the fury their valuable cheetah had escaped, potentially costing them significant money. "We can't let them leave," Jimmy said quietly. "They'll come back with more men. Search properly. They'll find us." "What are you suggesting?" Grace asked, though her expression showed she already knew. "Confrontation, but we're outnumbered and outgunned." "No," Marcus said, surprising himself with his certainty. "Not confrontation. Truth." He pulled out his phone, started recording video. Grace was right about evidence. These men killed Sarah, if we can get them talking. Meanwhile, Ruth battled for Hope's life. The infected tissue had been removed, but the cheetah's heart was failing, unable to maintain rhythm. "She's going into cardiac arrest," Ruth announced, beginning chest compressions on the sedated animal. The surreal scene, Ruth performing CPR on a cheetah while poachers prowled outside, would have been absurd if it weren't so desperate. Marcus found himself praying for the first time since Sarah's funeral, wordless pleas for Hope's survival. At 8:45 a.m., Jonas and his men reached the station door. There was no more hiding. Jimmy stepped out first, hands visible but ready to fight. Marcus followed, phone concealed but recording. "This is private property," Jimmy announced in the tone that had once commanded soldiers. Jonas smiled, revealing gold teeth. "We're tracking an injured animal. Humanitarian reasons." "Bullshit," Marcus heard himself say. "You're checking your snare, the one that caught a mother cheetah 3 days ago." Recognition flickered in Jonas's eyes as he studied Marcus. "You look familiar. Mzungu. Have we met?" "No, but you knew my wife, Sarah Coleman." The name hit Jonas visibly. His companions shifted nervously, hands moving toward weapons. But Jonas raised a hand, stopping them. "Sarah Coleman," Jonas repeated slowly. "The woman who thought she could save every animal in Kenya." "The woman you murdered," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his rage. Jonas laughed, but it was bitter, not amused. "Murder. She drove her vehicle into ours. Suicide, maybe. Murder, no. She was protecting a pregnant cheetah. This cheetah, actually." Marcus gestured toward the station. "The one your snare almost killed." Something shifted in Jonas's expression, not guilt, but a kind of weary recognition. "You want to know about your wife's death? Fine, I'll tell you the truth, since it changes nothing now." Grace appeared in the doorway, first aid kit in hand. playing the role of confused tourist perfectly while ensuring her camera captured everything. Jonas lit a cigarette, his scarred face contemplative. 10 years ago, we had the pregnant cheetah cornered, worth maybe $50,000 the cubs would sell for more. Your wife appeared from nowhere, driving like a maniac. But here's what the reports didn't say: she stopped first. Marcus's world tilted. What? She got out of her vehicle, stood between us and the cheetah, offered us money, everything she had to let it go. 20,000 shillings? We laughed. Then she offered something else. Jonas took a long drag. Her life for the cheetahs. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Even Jimmy looked stunned. I thought she was bluffing. Jonas continued. Told her to move, or we'd shoot both her and the cat. She said, and I remember this exactly, my husband will understand. Love isn't measured in years but in meaning. This creature's babies deserve to live. Then she got back in her truck and drove straight at us. Marcus felt his legs weaken. Grace steadied him while maintaining her facade. We jumped clear, but she hit our vehicle hard. Could have driven away. After that we were scattered, confused. Instead, she made sure the cheetah escaped, then sat there, waiting. By the time we reached her, she was dying. Internal bleeding. Jonas flicked his cigarette away. Her last words were strange. She grabbed my hand, dying woman, grabbing the hand of the man who'd caused it, and said, Tell my husband to follow the hearts. He'll understand when it's time. Inside the station, Ruth's voice rang out, I need everyone now. The urgency transcended everything else. Marcus ran inside, Jonas forgotten. Hope was in full cardiac arrest, her body convulsing despite the sedation. Ruth was performing chest compressions while Benjamin administered medications. She's not responding, Ruth gasped, sweat streaming down her face. We're losing her. And Sabi broke free from Amara's grip, racing to his mother's side. Before anyone could stop him, the young cub did something extraordinary. He began calling to her, a specific pattern of chirps and cries that Marcus had never heard before. It was almost like a song, repetitive and haunting. Wait, Ruth said, pausing compressions. Look at the heart monitor. Impossibly. There was a blip. Then another. Sabi continued his calling, pressing against his mother's neck, his voice growing stronger. Patience and faith joined in, creating a chorus of cheetah song that filled the small space. Hope's heart rhythm stabilized, weak, irregular, but present. That's impossible, Benjamin breathed. Medically impossible. The cub's vocalizations, Ruth said, her scientific mind racing even as she worked. There's research about how sound frequencies can affect cardiac rhythm. The cubs are literally calling her back. Marcus found himself moving without thinking, his hand on Sabi's small body, feeling the vibrations of his calls. He began humming Sarah's favorite hymn, the one she'd sung while working with injured animals. Ruth didn't stop him. If anything, Hope's heart rate improved slightly. They worked through the morning medical science and something beyond it combining in desperate effort. Jonas and his men had entered the station, weapons lowered, watching in amazement as the white-haired American woman performed heart surgery on a cheetah while her cubs sang her back to life. At 11:15 a.m., Ruth began closing the surgical incision. Hope's heart was beating steadily, the infection drained, antibiotics flowing directly into her cardiac tissue. The crisis had passed, though recovery remained uncertain. Why didn't you run? Marcus asked Jonas, who'd watched the entire procedure. Jonas seemed to struggle with the answer. I've killed many animals. It's business, survival. But this... He gestured to Hope, surrounded by her cubs. Sabi still maintaining physical contact with his mother. I've never seen them fight for each other like this. Never seen humans fight for them like this. Sarah saw it all the time, Marcus said quietly. That's why she chose them over herself. Jonas reached into his pocket, pulling out something wrapped in dirty cloth. I kept this. Don't know why. He unwrapped it, Sarah's wedding ring, twisted from the impact but intact. She was wearing it when it happened. Marcus took the ring with trembling hands. It was warm, as if it had been waiting for him. The inscription was still readable, forever and in all things M and S. The authorities will be here soon, Jimmy said quietly. That tourist from yesterday definitely reported us. Jonas looked at his men, then at Hope, still unconscious but breathing steadily. We were never here, he said finally. But the snare lines in this area, they're done. Bad luck ground now. He turned to Marcus. Your wife. She won the long game. The cheetah lived. Had cubs. Now those cubs will have cubs. She traded one life for many. She didn't trade anything, Ruth corrected, her hand still bloody from surgery. She invested. Love multiplies. It doesn't divide. As Jonas and his men left a retreat rather than escape, the station fell into exhausted silence. Hope's breathing was steady, her cubs pressed against her, maintaining contact. The morning sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows through the broken windows. Marcus sat beside Sabi, Sarah's ring in one hand, the other resting on the young cheetah's head. The cub looked up at him with those amber eyes, Sarah's angel with spots, and Marcus finally understood what she'd meant by follow the hearts. It wasn't just about the physical heart he'd helped Ruth repair, or even the love between human and animal. It was about the continuation of compassion. The way Sarah's sacrifice had created ripples that brought together an American professor, a veterinarian, a safari guide, a retired nurse, and even reformed the man who'd caused her death. Each heart touched by her love had become part of something larger. At noon on day 5, as Hope's eyes flickered open and focused on her cubs, Marcus heard Sarah's voice one last time, not in memory, but in the triumphant cries of 3 young cheetahs greeting their mother's return to life. Love had won, just as Sarah always believed it would. The afternoon of day 5 brought the first signs of disaster. Hope had survived the surgery, but by 3:00 p.m. her temperature spiked to dangerous levels. Ruth's face, already exhausted from the morning's desperate procedure, crumbled as she checked the readings for the 3rd time. Sepsis, she announced quietly. The infection we thought we'd beaten, it's spreading through her bloodstream. The antibiotics aren't working. Marcus watched the cheetah who'd fought so hard to live now struggling with each breath. The surgical site was clean, healing properly, but her body was losing a war they couldn't see. Hope's eyes, which had been bright with recognition that morning, were dulling again, retreating into that distant place where wild animals go when they're preparing to die. Sabi hadn't left his mother's side since the surgery. The young cub pressed against her, his small body vibrating with constant purring as if he could will her back to health through sound alone. But he'd refused all food since the previous evening. Ruth tried everything: fresh antelope meat, the milk supplement they'd been giving the cubs, even the special treats Jimmy had brought from camp. Sabi turned away from it all. He's grieving, Grace said softly, her weathered hands gentle as she stroked the cub's head. I've seen it in people. When someone we love is dying, eating feels like betrayal, like we're continuing to live while they're slipping away. Marcus understood that feeling intimately. He'd lost 20 pounds in the month after Sarah's death, unable to swallow past the grief that sat like a stone in his throat. Now, watching Sabi grow weaker, he felt that familiar helplessness, the crushing weight of being unable to save what mattered most. Benjamin had sourced stronger antibiotics from a contact in Nairobi, but the 4-hour round trip meant they wouldn't arrive until evening. Ruth administered what she had, but her movements lacked their usual confidence. We're fighting blind, she admitted. Without proper lab work, I can't identify the specific bacteria. I'm using broad-spectrum antibiotics, but if it's resistant... The situation deteriorated at 5:45 p.m. when Amara burst through the door. Rangers, 3 vehicles, they're at the main road, asking locals about suspicious activity in this area. Jimmy grabbed his binoculars, scanning through the broken window. They're systematic, checking every structure. We have maybe 30 minutes. We can't move Hope, Ruth said firmly. The stress would kill her immediately. And if they find us, Grace asked, though everyone knew the answer, Hope would be confiscated. likely euthanized as a contaminated animal. The cubs would be taken to a government facility, their chances of survival without their mother minimal, and the humans would face prosecution: Marcus for wildlife interference, Ruth for practicing veterinary medicine without Kenyan permits, Jimmy for abandoning his tour group and violating his operator's license terms. They worked frantically to hide evidence of their operation, but there was no disguising a post-surgical cheetah and 3 cubs. At 6:20 p.m., they heard engines approaching the abandoned station. Marcus made a decision. "I'll go out. Tell them I'm a lost tourist. Buy you time to what?" Ruth's voice cracked with exhaustion and defeat. "There's nowhere to go. Marcus, we tried. We failed." The lead ranger was a young man named William Odhiambo, earnest and by the book. His expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and finally stern disapproval as he took in the scene: the makeshift clinic, the injured cheetah, the clearly guilty humans. "This is illegal on so many levels," he said, his English precise and damning. "Wildlife interference, practicing veterinary medicine without permits, endangering protected species." He radioed for backup and a veterinary team. "You'll all need to come with us for processing." Day 6 dawned in catastrophe. Hope's condition had worsened overnight, her organs showing signs of shutdown despite the stronger antibiotics that had finally arrived. The government veterinarian who'd taken over her care was competent but overwhelmed, dealing with multiple cases. Hope had become just another number in the system. Marcus wasn't allowed near her. He'd been released after 12 hours of questioning but banned from the reserve pending investigation. Ruth had it worse. The Kenya Veterinary Board had suspended her volunteer credentials immediately. Pending review. Decades of conservation work were being erased by bureaucratic efficiency. Jimmy's situation was equally devastating. His employer, faced with potential liability and license revocation, had terminated him immediately. 20 years of building his reputation as one of Kenya's best guides, gone. "I knew the risks," he said when Marcus tried to apologize. "I made my choice. I'd make it again." Grace's tour company had insisted she return to Nairobi immediately or forfeit her entire trip cost. The other tourists in her group had complained vociferously about her abandoning them for some animals. She'd refused to leave, checking into a cheap hotel near the government veterinary facility. "My husband left me enough money to do whatever I damn well please," she declared, "and it pleases me to see this through." They were allowed one supervised visit on day 6 afternoon. Hope was in a sterile metal cage, IV lines running into her leg, her eyes closed. The cubs were in a separate enclosure, all 3 huddled together in the corner. Sabi looked skeletal, his ribs visible through his spotted coat. He'd continued refusing food. The government vet, Dr. Njoroge, was sympathetic but realistic. "The mother has maybe a 20% chance. The infection is antibiotic resistant. We're trying everything, but..." He shrugged. "The male cub is another concern. He's developed what we call failure to thrive. Sometimes when young animals undergo severe trauma, they simply give up." That evening, in Grace's hotel room, Marcus finally opened Sarah's journal to the last entry. His hands shook as he read her final words, written the morning she died. "The rains failed again this year, but I found something extraordinary: a flower that only blooms after the worst droughts. The locals call it Mawa ya Matumaini, flower of hope. I've pressed one here for Marcus. My love. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, but you're here, in Kenya, where my heart always lived. Remember, the greatest beauty comes from the harshest trials. The desert must be absolute before the miracle blooms. Don't give up when everything seems dead. That's when life is preparing its most magnificent surprise. Follow the hearts, my darling. They'll show you the way home." Pressed between the pages was a delicate flower, purple-white petals, paper-thin but intact. Marcus had seen it before Sarah had tried to grow them in Minnesota, but they'd never bloomed. They needed the extremity of drought, the desperation of near death, to trigger their flowering. Day 7 brought Marcus to his knees. Dr. Njoroge called at dawn. Hope's kidneys were failing. Her liver showed signs of shutdown. They were keeping her alive with machines, but it was prolonging the inevitable. "You should come say goodbye," he said gently. "Sometimes they wait for that for permission to let go." Marcus found the others already there. Ruth had aged years in days, her confident demeanor replaced by hollow defeat. Jimmy stood silent, his jaw clenched against emotion. Grace held Amara's hand as the young woman cried openly. Hope lay still, only the mechanical rise and fall of the ventilator indicating life. The cubs were with her doctor. Niroge had made that allowance, and all three pressed against their mother's cooling body. Sabi was barely conscious himself, his breathing shallow, his small body having consumed itself in grief. Marcus knelt beside the cage, pressing his palm against the bars. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered. I tried so hard, but I'm not you. I don't have your gift, your strength. I failed them like I failed you." Ruth placed a hand on his shoulder. Sarah wouldn't see failure here. She'd see love. Imperfect, messy, desperate love. But love nonetheless. "Love doesn't matter if they die," Marcus said bitterly. "Love always matters." Grace interjected, her voice firm despite her tears. "It matters that we tried. It matters that Sabi knew humans could be kind. It matters that Hope didn't die alone in the bush, but surrounded by people who fought for her." As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows through the facility windows, Marcus pulled out the pressed flower from Sarah's journal. It looked impossibly delicate, a whisper of life preserved between pages of memory. He thought about Sarah's words about beauty from trials, about miracles waiting in the appearance of death. "Show me the way home, Sarah," he whispered, clutching the flower. "I'm lost without you." Sabi stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to focus on Marcus. The cub made a sound barely audible, more breath than voice, that somehow conveyed both goodbye and plea. Marcus reached through the bars, his fingers brushing Sabi's fur, feeling the weak heartbeat beneath. Benjamin arrived as afternoon waned, bringing news that felt like the final blow. "The Kenya Wildlife Service has decided, if Hope doesn't improve by tomorrow morning, they'll euthanize her. They say it's humane, that she's suffering needlessly." "And the cubs?" Ruth asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Relocated to a government breeding program. They'll survive, but they'd never be wild. Never run free across the Mara. Never be what Sarah had died to preserve, wild hearts in wild bodies, living the life that was their birthright." As day 7 ended, Marcus sat in that sterile room watching Hope's labored breathing, Sabi's fading strength, and wondered if Sarah had been wrong. Maybe some fights couldn't be won. Maybe some hearts were meant to break. Maybe following love led not home but into deeper wilderness, where even hope, that flower that blooms after drought, couldn't take root in such barren ground. Day 8 began before dawn with Marcus sitting on the hard ground outside the veterinary facility, Sarah's pressed flower in his lap. He'd been there since 3:00 a.m., unable to sleep, waiting for the call that would tell him Hope had died in the night. But the call hadn't come. As the first light touched the horizon, Dr. Niroge emerged, his expression unreadable. "She's still alive," he said simply. "Barely, but alive. The cubs are with her. The male Sabi, he's been acting strange." Inside, Marcus found a scene that defied logic. Sabi, who'd been nearly comatose 12 hours earlier, was moving around his mother with purpose. The young cub held something in his mouth, a sprig of plant material. Purple-white flowers barely visible in the fluorescent light. He was trying to push it toward Hope's mouth, making soft chirping sounds. "Where did he get that?" Ruth asked, having arrived moments after Marcus. "Dr. Niroge looked embarrassed. "The night attendant said the cub was crying so persistently that he let him out into the exercise yard for a few minutes. There are some wild plants growing through the fence. The cub went straight to this particular plant, pulled off a branch, and carried it back. Marcus's hands trembled as he pulled out Sarah's journal, opening it to the pressed flower. It was identical, the same delicate petals, the same unusual leaf structure, the Mawa Yamatumeni flower of hope. Let him give it to her, Marcus said urgently. That's completely against protocol. Dr. Nyoroge protested. We don't know what that plant is, what it might do. I do, a voice said from the doorway. Sankao, the Maasai elder who'd helped them before, entered with quiet authority. Benjamin had called him, desperate for any traditional knowledge that might help. This plant, we call it Olmo-2. Cheetahs have always known it. When injured, they seek it out. My grandfather watched them, learned from them. We use it for infections that won't heal. Ruth grabbed Marcus's journal, frantically flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. Pages stuck together that Marcus hadn't noticed before. She carefully separated them, revealing Sarah's hidden research notes, written in tiny script, breakthrough discovery. Local cheetahs demonstrate deliberate pharmacological self-medication. Observed 3 separate individuals seeking out Rauvolfia mani variant. Local Mawaya Matumaini Olmo-2 when suffering from bacterial infections. Plant contains unique alkaloid compounds with powerful antibiotic properties, particularly effective against resistant strains. Indigenous knowledge confirms multi-generational observations. Cheetahs teach their cubs to identify the plant. This could revolutionize understanding of animal intelligence and lead to new antibiotics for human use. Must document properly before publishing. This will change everything. Sarah knew, Ruth breathed. She discovered something extraordinary and never got to share it. Please, Marcus begged Dr. Nyoroge. What do we have to lose? She's dying anyway. The government vet wrestled with the decision, then slowly opened the cage door. Sabi immediately approached his mother, pressing the plant against her barely open mouth. Hope's eyes flickered, and incredibly, her tongue emerged, weakly pulling the flowers and leaves into her mouth. The female cubs, Sankao said suddenly. Look. Patience and Faith were also eating small amounts of the plant, though neither appeared sick. Prevention, Benjamin said in wonder. They're preventing infection before it starts. Within 2 hours, Hope's vitals stabilized. Her temperature, which had been dangerously high, began dropping. By noon, she was conscious, weakly grooming Sabi, who hadn't left her side. Dr. Nyoroge ran blood tests, comparing them to samples from 6 hours earlier. This is impossible, he said, staring at the results. The bacterial load has decreased by 60%. Her white cell count is normalizing. Whatever that plant contains, it's more effective than our strongest antibiotics. Grace had been quietly documenting everything on her camera. Marcus, I need to show you something. She pulled up earlier footage, zooming in on Faith, the smaller female cub. There, on her chest partially hidden by her spots, was a marking that looked remarkably like a heart. Just like her mother's mother, Sankao said, studying the cub. I remember the grandmother, we called her Moyo, which means heart. She had the same mark. My father knew her mother. Also marked. This line of cheetahs. They've always been special. They know things. Remember things. Ruth was examining Hope more carefully now, her scientific mind racing. Marcus, this genetic line, if they've been self-medicating for generations, they might have developed unique immunities, behavioral patterns that are learned and passed down. This isn't just one miraculous rescue. This is scientifically groundbreaking. By day 8 afternoon, word had somehow leaked. Amara had shared the story with a friend, who'd shared it with another friend. And suddenly, Marcus's phone was buzzing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Grace's footage had been uploaded to social media by her granddaughter back in Texas, thinking it was just an interesting animal rescue. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. American professor saves cheetah that changed his late wife's life, read one headline. Miracle plant saves dying. Cheetah, could it save humans too? Read another. But it was the third that caught international attention. Cheetah remembers woman who saved her 10 years ago, seeks help from her widower. The Kenya Wildlife Service, faced with mounting international pressure and interest, suddenly changed their tune. Dr. Njoroge was no longer talking about euthanasia, but about establishing a special research program. Representatives from the World Wildlife Fund were already en route from Nairobi. That evening, as hope continued to improve, eating solid food for the first time in days, an unexpected visitor arrived. Jonas Mutua, the poacher who'd been present at Sarah's death, entered with visible discomfort, clearly unwilling to be there but compelled by something stronger than reluctance. "I brought something," he said gruffly, producing a worn notebook from his pocket. "After your wife died, I went back to the crash site, found this thrown clear, kept it. Don't know why. Maybe guilt, maybe respect, but you should have it." It was another of Sarah's journals, one Marcus had never seen. This one was dedicated entirely to her research on the heartline, the family of cheetahs with the distinctive marking, page after page of observations, photographs, behavioral notes. And throughout, references to the medicinal plant and the cheetah's use of it. She was tracking them for 3 years, Ruth said, reading over Marcus's shoulder, documenting how mothers taught cubs to identify healing plants, how they passed knowledge through generations. This is anthropological-level cultural transmission in animals. The final entry, dated the day Sarah died, was addressed to Marcus. "My darling, if you're reading this, it means you found them, the hearts I've been following. Hope the mother I saved is pregnant again. Her mother had the heart mark, and I believe at least one of these cubs will too. They're not just cheetahs. Marcus, they're living libraries, carrying knowledge we're only beginning to understand. If something happens to me, promise you'll protect them. The world needs to know that animals aren't just instinct and reaction, they're intelligence and wisdom passed down through generations. The Heartline proves it. Follow them, my love. They'll teach you what they taught me, that healing isn't just physical. It's the knowledge we pass on, the love we leave behind, the connections that transcend even death." Day 9 brought revelations that changed everything. The World Wildlife Fund representatives, led by Dr. James Patterson from their international board, had reviewed all the documentation, Sarah's journals, Ruth's medical notes, Grace's footage, and the laboratory analysis of the Alma-2 plant. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Patterson announced at an impromptu press conference at the facility. "Dr. Sarah Coleman appears to have documented the first definitive proof of medicinal culture in wildcats. The implications for biology, conservation, and even pharmaceutical development are staggering. The plant analysis had revealed compounds unlike anything in current medical databases, natural antibiotics that remained effective against resistant bacteria, anti-inflammatory agents that worked without suppressing immune response, and most remarkably, compounds that seem to accelerate healing at the cellular level. We're offering Mr. Coleman a position," Dr. Sir Patterson continued, "to head the Sarah Coleman Research Initiative, studying this cheetah lineage and their medicinal knowledge. The Kenyan government has agreed to establish a special conservation zone around their territory." Marcus stood stunned as the official offer was made public. Ruth would be reinstated and made lead veterinarian. Jimmy would be hired as the program's field coordinator. Even Grace had been approached about funding an education center through her late husband's foundation. But the most remarkable moment came when they returned to Hope's enclosure. She was standing, weight on all 4 legs, including the injured one. When she saw Marcus, she did something cheetahs rarely do. She purred, loud and sustained, a sound of recognition and perhaps gratitude. Sabi immediately ran to Marcus, no longer the desperate, dying cub, but vibrant with life. He rubbed against Marcus's legs like a house cat, purring in harmony with his mother. The female cubs approached too, Faith with her distinctive heart marking clearly visible. Patience with her own unique pattern that Sarah's notes suggested might appear in 1 cub per generation. "The heart line," Dr. Patterson said softly. Your wife discovered something that will revolutionize our understanding of animal intelligence. These cheetahs aren't just genetically unique, they're culturally unique. They carry knowledge, pass it down, adapt it. They remember across generations. As cameras clicked and reporters pressed for statements, Marcus knelt beside Sabi, one hand on the cub's head, the other holding Sarah's recovered journal. He understood now what she'd meant by follow the hearts. It wasn't just about following love or compassion, though those mattered. It was about following the actual hearts, the marked cheetahs who carried not just genes, but knowledge, not just instinct, but wisdom. The reversal was complete. What had seemed like desperate failure a day ago had transformed into groundbreaking discovery. Hope would survive. The cubs would thrive. The heartline would continue, protected and studied. Sarah's research would be published, her name attached to a discovery that would appear in textbooks for generations. But for Marcus, the greatest reversal was personal. He'd come to Kenya to say goodbye, to leave Sarah's journal at a memorial, and finally let go. Instead, he'd found his purpose to continue her work, to protect these remarkable animals, to ensure that the knowledge they carried would never be lost. As the sun set on day 9, painting the African sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus watched Hope teach her cubs to identify the olmotu plant growing through the fence, showing them how to select the right leaves, the proper flowers. It was a lesson their ancestors had taught for generations, knowledge that had saved Hope's life and would save others. "I found the way home, Sarah," Marcus whispered, knowing somehow that she could hear him. "It was never a place. It was a purpose. And you left me the map written in hearts and flowers, in courage and compassion, in the eyes of a cheetah cub who knew to trust your love even in me." Day 10 dawned with bureaucratic miracles. The Kenyan Ministry of Wildlife, pressured by international attention and scientific significance, fast-tracked a conservation designation that typically took years. The 50-square-kilometer area surrounding the abandoned ranger station became the Sarah Coleman Wildlife Conservation Zone, protected from development and hunting in perpetuity. Hope stood in the morning sun, her surgical scars hidden beneath regrown fur, watching her cubs play with the unconscious grace of young predators. Dr. Njoroge, who'd become an advocate after witnessing her recovery, signed the release papers with visible emotion. 6 days ago, I was preparing to euthanize her, he admitted. Now she's the most important cheetah in Kenya, maybe the world. The poaching ring's destruction had been swift and complete. Jonas Mutua, transformed by what he'd witnessed, had provided names, locations, and routes. 23 arrests were made across Kenya and Tanzania. The syndicate that had operated for 15 years, that had killed Sarah and countless animals, was finished. Jonas himself faced prosecution, but had negotiated a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation and testimony. "Your wife's death meant something," the prosecutor told Marcus. "These convictions will save hundreds of animals." 3 months later, the transformation was remarkable. Where the abandoned ranger station had stood, a modern research facility now rose the Sarah Coleman Wildlife Research Center. Solar panels gleamed on the roof. A water treatment system hummed efficiently, and a veterinary clinic rivaled any in Nairobi. The funding had come from unexpected sources. Grace's late husband's foundation provided the initial investment, but when the story went viral, donations had poured in from around the world. Marcus stood in what was now his office, Sarah's journals displayed in climate-controlled cases, her pressed flower framed above his desk. He wore field khakis instead of Professor Tweed's, his skin bronzed from the African sun, his body leaner and stronger from daily work with the animals. The wedding ring Jonas had returned hung on a chain beside a new ring, not a replacement, but a continuation, inscribed with "Forward in Love." Ruth burst in with excitement. "Marcus, you need to see this. The botanical team found another olmotu grove, and it's massive." The medicinal plant that had saved Hope was now the subject of intensive study. 3 pharmaceutical companies had partnered with the center, funding research while guaranteeing that profits would return to conservation. Early trials suggested the plant's compounds could fight antibiotic-resistant infections that killed thousands annually. Sarah's discovery, carried forward through Hope's survival, might save human lives across the globe. Outside, Jimmy supervised the anti-poaching unit he'd built from scratch. 15 rangers, all local Maasai who knew the land intimately, patrolled with drones and night vision equipment. Not a single snare had been found in 3 months. "We protect what we understand," Jimmy said, watching his team. Sarah understood that. Now we all do. The education center Grace had funded hosted 40 children that day, their voices bright with excitement as they learned about the Heartline cheetahs. Marcus taught them using Sarah's own materials, her sketches and observations transformed into lessons about ecology, empathy, and the intelligence of animals. "Cheetahs are the fastest land animals," young David recited. "But the Heartline cheetahs are the smartest. They remember medicine across generations." The reunion happened at sunset. Marcus had made this pilgrimage daily since Hope's release 6 weeks earlier, sitting in the spot where he'd first met Sabi, waiting. Some days he saw nothing. Other days, he glimpsed distant shapes moving through the grass. But today was different. Hope emerged from the acacia trees, her movement fluid and powerful, fully healed. Behind her came patience and faith, now adolescents, their bodies lengthening toward adult proportions. Faith's heart marking had darkened and defined, making her instantly recognizable even at a distance. And beside them, nearly as large as his sisters now, came Sabi. The young male approached Marcus without hesitation, rubbing his massive head against Marcus's shoulder with enough force to nearly knock him over. The purr that rumbled from Sabi's chest was deeper now, adult-sized. But the eyes remained the same amber, intelligent, trusting. "Hello, friend," Marcus whispered, his hands moving through familiar greeting rituals, checking Sabi's condition while the cheetah permitted the contact. The young male was magnificent strong, healthy, his coat gleaming with vitality. Hope maintained her distance but watched with what Marcus could only interpret as approval. She'd learned to trust him. But wild dignity kept her from approaching. She didn't need to. The connection was there in how she allowed her most precious cubs to interact with him, in how she brought them regularly to this spot. Faith surprised everyone by approaching Grace, who'd been documenting the reunion. The young female with the heart marking sniffed the elderly woman's outstretched hand, then settled beside her, allowing Grace to stroke her spotted coat. "She knows I'm no threat," Grace said softly, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Old recognizes old, perhaps. We both know what it means to be the keeper of memories." Ruth's latest discovery had confirmed what Sankow had long known. The Heartline wasn't just one family but a genetic trait that appeared in roughly 1 in 12 cheetahs in this region. The marking correlated with specific behavioral patterns, enhanced problem-solving abilities, stronger social bonds, and most remarkably, the ability to identify and use medicinal plants. "It's evolution in real time," Ruth explained to visiting scientists. "Natural selection favoring intelligence and medical knowledge." Sarah documented the beginning of what might be a cognitive leap in the species. As darkness approached on this anniversary day, exactly 1 year since Marcus had first encountered Sabi, Hope revealed her greatest secret. She called softly, and from the tall grass came 3 tiny forms. New cubs, perhaps 8 weeks old, their baby fluff still visible beneath emerging spots. 1 male, 2 females, and on the chest of the smallest female, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a perfect heart-shaped marking. "The line continues," Marcus breathed, watching the tiny cub tumble over her siblings with infant clumsiness. Sabi, now an uncle, approached the cubs with gentle curiosity, allowing them to paw at his face and chew his ears with the patience of family. The scene was impossibly tender. 3 generations of Heartline cheetahs, alive and thriving because Sarah had chosen love over life, because Marcus had chosen courage over safety, because strangers had become family in service of something greater. As the cheetahs melted back into the growing darkness, Marcus remained seated, absorbing the moment. A year ago, he'd been a broken widower seeking closure. Now he was guardian of Sarah's legacy, protector of the Heartline, bridge between human and animal worlds. Jimmy's voice crackled over the radio. "Marcus, the medical team from Johns Hopkins has arrived. They want to discuss the Olmo-2 synthesis project." "Coming," Marcus replied, but he lingered for one more moment. The rains had finally come after years of drought, and the landscape was transforming. Where dust had ruled, green pushed through, and everywhere, like stars scattered across the earth, the Olmo-2 plants bloomed purple-white flowers that held healing in their petals, that connected cheetahs to their ancestral knowledge, that had brought Marcus home to a purpose he'd never imagined. 3 months became 6, then 12. The research center grew into an international destination for scientists and conservationists. The Heartline cheetahs became the most studied population in Africa, their intelligence and medical knowledge rewriting textbooks. The Olmo-2 plant yielded 3 new antibiotics that earned Sarah a posthumous Nobel Prize nomination. But for Marcus, success was measured in simpler moments. Sabby's visits, now with his own maiden cubs, Faith becoming the center's ambassador cheetah, comfortable enough with humans to educate thousands about her species. Hope, now a grandmother, still strong and wild, teaching her newest litter the ancient knowledge of healing plants. One evening, as Marcus taught local children to identify Olmo-2 flowers, knowledge that might one day save their lives, 8-year-old Amara, named after their friend, asked, "Mr. Marcus, why did your wife save the cheetahs even though she died?" Marcus considered his answer carefully, then knelt to the child's level. "Because she understood that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into legacy, into purpose, into the lives that continue because of our choices. Every cheetah born to the Heartline, every person healed by the medicine they showed us, every child who learns to see animals as teachers rather than threats, that's Sarah's love. Still alive, still growing." The child nodded solemnly, then brightened. "So she's not really gone?" "No," Marcus said, looking out over the Mara where cheetahs moved like shadows through the grass, where Olmo-2 flowers bloomed in impossible abundance, where Sarah's dream had become reality. "She's more present than ever. She lives in every heart, human and cheetah, that chooses compassion over indifference, courage over comfort, love over fear." As the sun set on another day in the Sarah Coleman Conservation Zone, Marcus understood what she'd meant by "follow the hearts." It was never about the ending. It was about the continuation, love passing from heart to heart, generation to generation, species to species, an unbroken chain of compassion that death could interrupt but never sever. The cheetahs had taught him what Sarah always knew, that healing happens not in isolation but in connection, not in ending but in beginning again, not in moving on but in moving forward, carrying the love of those we've lost into the love we have yet to give. I need to tell you something I've learned, something Sarah knew long before me. Family isn't just blood or species, it's the constellation of hearts that choose to beat in rhythm with yours. When Sabi first tugged at my pants that day, he wasn't just seeking help. He was offering me membership in something ancient, something that transcends the boundaries we've built between human and animal. Gratitude, I've discovered, is the language that needs no translation. Hope's eyes speak it when she brings her grandcubs to visit. Sabi's purr vibrates with it when he rests his massive head against my shoulder. Even Jonas, the man present at Sarah's death, expresses it in his monthly letters from prison, where he teaches inmates about conservation. We think we're the only species that remembers, that grieves, that loves across time. We're wrong. The Heartline cheetahs proved that to me. They remember Sarah through me, just as I remember her through them. They've taught me that losing someone doesn't mean losing the love. It means finding new vessels for it, unexpected families to pour it into. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't healing from loss, but learning to carry it beautifully, transforming grief into purpose, sorrow into service, endings into infinite beginnings.